Welcome everybody to the second part of the BTOG Advocacy Training webinar. So building on part one, this session continues to explore how patient advocates can meaningfully contribute to research, bringing the patient voice into the development, delivery, and evaluation of research. Whether you are already working as a professional patient advocate or you are interested in becoming involved, we hope this session will provide practical insight to support your role. It is important to say that sponsors of BTOG do not have any role whatsoever in the planning or delivery of anything discussed. It is a pleasure for me to be together again with Sally Hall and Allan Hackshaw. Sally is a patient advocate, member of the BTOG Steering Committee and BTOG Research Group. Professor Allan Hackshaw is Director of the Cancer Research UK UCL Clinical Trial Centre, and Allan is a former member of the BTOG Steering Committee. This session will include two presentations, followed by a fireside chat with Sally, who will share her personal experience and perspective on patient advocacy in research. I will start giving an overview of the input of a patient advocate on the research planning and more specifically on the grant application perspective. Thank you so much. Thanks again for, of course, showing this interest, because what I really would like to discuss is a very practical question. So what can a patient advocate actually contribute when we are developing a research proposal? This is something that we've been asked several times as researchers. So sometimes researchers know they should involve patient and patient knows they have been invited to contribute, but neither side is completely clear about what meaningful involvement really looks like. So patient brings for sure expertise that researchers cannot replace. And sometimes I'm also, for us, it's very important to underline that patient perspective is also a holistic perspective from the what we call caregivers, carers, or nowadays also main support person. So definitely you don't need to be a researcher. That's a first point that we really would like to stress. Your role is to ask the question that may sometimes be overlooked. Does this matter to the patient? So the topic that has been put in this grant application. Would I participate as a patient? Is the burden acceptable, which is a very important aspect, especially when we are talking about very long trials. Are we measuring what really matters? So your role is to challenge the researcher and improve the proposals. And I'm always saying to the PPI involved in our trial steering committee, that is not, the main role is definitely not to approve the researcher's idea, but those challenges are really for us the most important ones. So this slide shows the patient journey through a study, essentially, from the baseline, what we call baseline, so the diagnosis and the treatment decision through recruitment, consent, intervention, follow-up, and finally the results. When reviewing a proposal, I will encourage you to mentally walk through that journey as if you were the participant, because this is really what we would like to understand. And your previous experience usually is giving us the important information that as a researcher or healthcare professionals are not, we are not able to fully understand. So at every stage, ask, what will this feel like for the patient? How much traveling is involved? How many appointments? Are the questionnaires, especially when we are talking about patient-reported outcomes, too long? Could the research interfere with the treatment, work, but also your family life? So, and importantly, after giving all this time and information to the study, how will the patient will hear about the results? So I like this slide because it shows that PPI is not a single event, it's a cycle. So ideally, we identify and connect with patient partners very early, then explore together what really matters, design and study together, and explicitly plan the PPI involvement and contribution in the grant, including, of course, the time commitment and also the budget required for reimbursement of patient and public partners' participation. And IHR standards give us a useful framework for good PPI involvement. So these are the key aspects, of course, the inclusion. So the having different experience and background is also very, very critical for the new grant application, but also the partnership, the support, and the communication, because at the end, we really need to understand what actually changed because patients were involved. So all these standards also tell the patient advocates what they should expect. So to be supported, to be listened, and also treated as partners. That's why, for example, support, learning, and training are very important, but they're always there. So we are always very keen to understand which are the main, essentially, training needs. So I think one of the aspects that is really important when considering this input is about choosing the right outcomes. So researchers naturally think about survival, complication, biomarker, so all these different clinical objective parameters that, of course, are the core of a study design. But patients may also prioritize quality of life, independence, symptoms, and definitely treatment burden. So I love the question about if this treatment works medically, what does success look like for the patient or for the caregivers, the carers that are around the patients? So I would like to give you an example also from our own lung cancer research about when we actually ask the patient about, for example, the quality of life assessment in a trial, we found that they valued more. I mean, they value the collection of quality of life more than expected, because it's something that could help them reflect on recovery and support conversation with clinicians. And this type of outcome was a completely different perspective that we had at the beginning when we plan and submit this application. So I think that this is very important. And in this case, of course, was definitely on quality of life. So I like to show also those quotes because it's something very practical from the patient perspective to collect quality of life outcomes and also the timing of this collection. Again, a questionnaire that for us look perfectly reasonable in a protocol may arrive when someone is recovering from surgery or complication and may not be so practical. So those are exactly the kind of insight that researchers need from patients. And if those insights are also made when the patient and when the researcher is developing the grant, this is of course something that will change definitely the protocol and potentially the successful application. So this is a kind of practical checklist when somebody asks you to review a grant. So again, don't worry being a methodology expert, but ask yourself if you think that the topic is really important, realistic, and inclusive. Are those outcomes very important for a patient, and can I see how the patient input has actually changed this proposal? So researchers should also be very transparent about time commitment. As I said before, patient involvement may include a few meetings during grant development, reviewing documents, and then ongoing involvement in advisory or steering groups. So I think it is of paramount importance that those expectations should be clear from the beginning. So this is your right to ask the researcher about this time commitment through all the grant application, research, and possibly also at the end of the grant. And you don't know, but there are also a lot of resources, and you don't have to do this without support, essentially. And IHR Cancer Research UK provide excellent training and resources, but also I will stress, as Allan, I'm sure, will do again, that local university PPI groups and clinical trial units can also be a very useful place to gain experience, support, and proper training on PPI role. So I'll finish with one message. So of course, better research start with partnership. And of course, for us, is still so important to submit very meaningful grant applications. So patient advocates bring a perspective we cannot reproduce definitely as a researcher or healthcare professional. So when that expertise is included from the beginning, research becomes more relevant, feasible, and meaningful. So again, thank you, because all the PPI that I had the pleasure to work with in my grant application were always very, very their feedback were so meaningful that we were able to change also the grant protocol or application. But I think also for the future collaboration and involvement will be a completely different perspective when this involvement is at the grant application stage. So thank you so much again. It is my pleasure now to introduce the second presentation from Allan, where we will transition a little bit more on understanding the research results. Allan, thanks again, and please, over to you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Hello, everybody. Cecilia's done a very good approach to looking at what happens with your involvement at the beginning of a study, with developing the study and the grant application. And I'm now going to take you to the very end of a study and what happens then with the investigators and the patient advocates. I think it's really exciting for patient partners, and I've been involved with many over the years, that they've been involved in a study from the very start and they see all the way through to the end, are involved in interpreting what the impacts are on patients. So it's a really key attribute. I think, as I said, really exciting, I think, when I see patients do it. So what's the relevance of this to the patient advocates and partners? Well, it's to get some understanding of why it's important that cancer treatments are tested and evaluated properly. We might take it for granted, but I'll show you some examples where you think it's not so clear cut. Understand that a new treatment, unfortunately, does not work for anybody. There are very, very few treatments, whether it's cancer or otherwise, that works for everybody it's given to. And it's finding out what that balance is between how much does it work for, how much does it not work for, that requires us to interpret new treatments. How we define effectiveness, it's a nice simple word and we use in everyday language, but what do we actually mean when it comes to evaluating cancer treatments? Is it survival, how long one lives for? Is it symptoms, quality of life, or other kinds of outcomes? And then ultimately, it's always going to be the benefits between and at the end, it's always going to be a balance between the benefits and the harms before we say, actually, we recommend this new treatment going forwards. So let me take us back to 1906, 1908. This was an advertisement for a cancer cure before all the regulations were in place in all the countries. So people can put out all sorts of claims in the newspapers and media. And this was you can see Mrs. Bridges' cure for cancer. It was an excruciating ointment rubbed on people's skin who had cancer. And in the advertisements, there was only ever mention of one or two people who said, oh, my cancer shrank or it got better. There was no mention of any of the people who progressed and died, unfortunately. So she was prosecuted for medical fraud, as you might well imagine. And this is why we have well-designed and properly conducted clinical studies to avoid damaging claims like this. And when I teach, I always say to people, do you think these kinds of claims can happen today? And the answer is, oh, no, not really. However, we've got that wonderful thing called social media. And the answer is yes. So this is something that had lots of media attention a couple of years ago. This is, again, one patient He had a very aggressive form of lung cancer, and he said that he used this thing called fenbendazole, and that his tumor shrank, which is not impossible, but highly unusual for this aggressive form of lung cancer. And it was even featured on the Joe Rogan show with Mel Gibson. So you've got a very famous actor saying, "Oh, this drug looks like it works. I've got 3 friends that it helped with." So you can imagine if you're in the general population, you think, well, actually, this must have some kind of traction behind it. It turns out later on that this patient was actually on a clinical trial at the same time, being given a very effective immunotherapy. And so when you see that, you think, well, hang on, did his cancer shrink because of the immunotherapy of this thing called fenbendazole? And this is one of the key things that we try and distinguish when we put people into a clinical study. And this fenbendazole, it's doing its rounds on the social media. I came across it a few months ago. What is it? It's to treat dogs and horses for stomach parasites. Would you believe? You can buy it on the internet. And it's very easy to think, well, why are people buying this thing for cancer? Even after you see Mel Gibson tell people to do it. Well, if someone's got an advanced cancer, you can understand ways of trying to find to live longer. So it's you can understand why people do that. Is there anything wrong with this, though? Well, the formal efficacy evidence on this is actually really low. When you look at publications that have been peer-reviewed and checked, there's hardly any strong evidence, and any evidence at all, really, that this works. And there's also a clear problem with liver disease. And this one person died from liver disease by taking this drug. So it's not as rosy as it's made out to be when you don't run these clinical studies in the way that we're supposed to run them, and we encourage ourselves. So let's have a simple look at how we start to interpret research findings. And because once patient advocates can do that, they get much more involved in interpreting the research at the end and how we display the evidence to patients and the public. Okay, so I'm going to do some very hypothetical example. Let's say we take 10 patients given a new cancer drug. So I'm not going to do anything fancy whatsoever. And let's look at the number of patients whose tumor shrank. So you have a tumor of a certain size, how many of those where the tumor shrinks? So intuitively, which of these results feels impressive to you? Okay, and there are usually other kinds of measures of benefit. So we can look at survival. So this is just one of many. So you've got 10 patients given this drug. If 2 patients had a tumor shrink, what does that feel like to you? Does that feel like it's worthwhile? Does it feel impressive? What about 4? What about 8? So now you're probably thinking, oh, now that looks impressive, aren't you? And what about 10? So all 10 improve, okay? So there's no right or wrong answer to this, but just what your intuitive feeling tells you. So you might think 8 to 10 looks okay. So now I'm going to say, we've got these 10 patients given the new therapy. Let's compare them to 10 patients given the usual therapy that they normally would have been given if they had not gone into a clinical study. So the outcome is the same. So let's go with 8. 8 looks quite impressive, didn't it? So let's assume that only 1 patient would normally have their tumor shrink. This looks pretty good, 8 versus 1. What about 8 versus 3? And again, not asking you to do anything that Stephen Hawkins would do, by the way, just what your intuitive feeling says to you. But 8 versus 6? Now, 8 and 8 look the same, doesn't it? And then here we've got 8 and 10. So you can see just by throwing in that control group, this is called a control group, is essentially how do patients normally do when they are given standard drug, not the new drug? The situation might look a bit different. And we want to know, well, what is the key message from this? Well, we usually need to know the benefits in comparison to what patients would normally have with current standard of care or current standard treatments. Because if 8 or 10 patients usually have their tumor shrink with the usual care, and we see 8 with the new drug, what might look impressive on its own doesn't look very impressive now, I'm afraid. And so that comparison group is a key thing for us. So it's a key aspect of how we interpret the efficacy of new cancer therapies. So let's understand this a little bit better. So if there are 10 patients given the new drug, 10 patients given usual therapy, 8 whose tumor shrank, but let's say 3 tumor shrink with 10 patients given usual therapy. That looks sort of okay, doesn't it? But to remind ourselves, it also means that there are 2 patients with the new therapy, their tumor did not shrink, and 7 in the other group whose tumor did not shrink. And I hope the message gets across here that not everyone will benefit from a new therapy. That's on the left-hand side. But even on the right-hand side with the usual therapy, there usually always is some patients who benefit. Okay. So a general fact about almost all cancer therapies, not all, but almost all, is that some patients will benefit, some patients don't benefit, and there may be various reasons why some don't benefit. It could be some genetic factors. It could be something in the tumor itself that we can now measure with the biomarkers or some genetic mutation. It could be lifestyle or diet, or it could be unknown reasons that we haven't found out yet. But it's trying to find the balance between these two. So when we ask the question, how can we tell whether a new therapy is better? If we want to see more patients who benefit with a new therapy, so we don't expect everyone to benefit, we just need to see more patients benefit with new compared to the usual standard therapy. And this is a sort of hopefully a simplest way of looking how we do this, but there's more fancy ways, but the fundamentals are the same. And there are 3 people or 3 groups of people that are the target of when we evaluate treatments. The most obvious ones is yourself, patients and the carers. So they're the ones who experience the treatment and the outcomes. They're the most important, obviously. You then have the clinicians, so the oncologists. They're the ones that recommend and deliver the treatments to patients after consultation over what's appropriate or not. And then we have the NHS, if we are in the UK. So who has to deliver the treatment as well as the conditions, but they also have to pay for those treatments as well. So when we evaluate new cancer therapies, it's driven by what happens to a group of patients, not what happens to an individual, because we know that some patients benefit and some don't. And at the end of a research study, we have to look at some key numbers. And I know that many people think, oh, numbers I don't like. I remember that from school. I don't like numbers. Well, unfortunately, they really help us to have a clear look at what's going on. And these numbers tell us what happened in each treatment group. So it's almost unavoidable, I'm afraid. So I'll just go through an example. This is Keytruda, which is a type of immunotherapy. It was brought out several years ago to treat lung cancer. The standard treatment at the time was chemotherapy using a drug called docetaxel. And in this trial, they compared 2 doses of immunotherapy with standard chemotherapy. And on the right-hand side, you see a diagram. And for many of you, that looked like gobbledygook. You won't have any idea how to interpret it. Many years ago, it took me a while to figure out how to use it. How can I make sense of it? But there are some very simple things we can get from it. Okay, and I'm just going to show you what these 2 things are. And so if you do become involved in research, this is one of the things that we can be taught to do. And I can promise you it's much easier than you think it is. So that some people make it a bit too more complicated than it really is. But we can look at it in 2 ways. We can look at how long on average patients live for. So on the standard treatment, it was 8 months on average. Some patients live longer, some patients live less, but on average it's 8. And in the Keytruda, the new drug, it's 15 months on average. So you can see visually, just by eye, it's longer with the new drug. And all we have to do is take the difference. And I think many of us can just take a difference in your own head, but don't worry if you can't. And by the way, many times I use my phone calculator for even doing very simple things because I can't be bothered to do it in my head. So do not worry. So this would be an extra 7 months of life on average with this new therapy. We can also look at the chance of being alive at 1 year. And so it's 40% with the standard chemotherapy and 50% with the new drug. So again, you can see it's higher with the new drug. And all we do here is just take the difference. 55 minus 40 is 15 and 100. And this means in 100 patients given the new drug, there are an extra 15 who are alive at 1 year. Okay, so you can see they're quite different. And what I'm hoping to show you is that benefit can be measured in 2 different ways. We can measure benefit using time, an extra 7 months of life on average, or we can use benefit measured using the chance of being alive, how many patients extra patients are alive at 1 year. And both are useful, both are correct. They're just different ways of looking at benefit. I could ask the question to you, which of these do you understand more easily? And patients have the preference of one or the other, and it's perfectly fine. And when, as investigators, we evaluate new treatments, we look at these two and others as well. So we look at a package of different ways of measuring benefit to make sure we know the full impact of these new therapies on patients. And the key thing is for patient partners and advocates who are involved in research at the end of a study to go through these kinds of results with ourselves, make sure they understand it, because you'll get a good idea of what's going on, and then you can explain and communicate to other patients and the wider group going forwards. And those two simple ways, I hope they're simple ways, by the way, and they don't put you off with those just the bit of numbers. We can use those very similar approach, looking at all kinds of outcome measures, whether it's recurrence, does the cancer come back, progression, does the cancer grow, side effects, symptoms, and health-related quality of life. And when we evaluate cancer drugs at the end, we have to look at benefit, side effects and symptoms, and quality of life. So you've got three different groups of things we have to look at. Sometimes you get a lot of benefit and minimal side effects. Sometimes the benefit is okay, but not impressive, but the side effects is very low. So it's the balance is not an obvious, and not everyone will agree on the harms and benefit balance as well. And this is one of the beauty of getting together with a group of patients to figure out, well, should this new treatment be recommended or not? And the goal is to find an appropriate balance across all patients going forwards. So I hope that was a fairly straightforward overview, and thank you very much for your time for listening.
Much, Alan. That was a really insightful presentation and great reminder that understanding those results is not about just about the numbers, and the same is for us, but also being able to interpret those results in the context of treatment or patient population. So I really think that this is such an important skill for patient advocates when they are helping us.
You said it in your talk. It's not just the numbers; it's actually what the numbers mean to me. What do they reflect for me as a patient? That's the key thing.
And I think, as I said, that those reflections are so important at every stage of the research cycle. And this is why from a patient perspective, only from the lived experience, we can get more feedback. And this is why we are so fortunate to have Sally now with us, who will give us some feedback on her experience in participating in research. So thank you again, Sally, for helping us in this webinar series. I will start off with this chat about comments on those presentations that we've seen now. So my first question for you is, from a patient advocate's perspective, what do you think make involvement in a grant application more meaningful, rather than this idea of being like a simple checking the box initiative, which is something that we heard many times. And again, I may be biased because I had always the topic related to health-related quality of life are helping patient perspective to be embedded in those grant application, for example. But I think it's very important. So I really would like to know from your side, which are the key aspects? How do you think that patient advocates may contribute more from the grant application stage?
Well, thank you for your presentation. And I think the first thing to say is we bring real life experience, which, however much researchers have read about it and spoken to patient advocates, they just really can't understand. And to be involved meaningfully, you've got to be involved right from the very beginning, or literally the beginning, if not before, whether that was possible. in development of the application, because in the development of application, there will be patient-facing documents, development of questionnaires that really do affect how a patient or their carer or anybody takes part in it. Nobody wants onerous 10 pages of questions when you're even at the beginning of a trial, or if you're on treatment further down. Somebody wants a piece of paper or something online that is actually going to explain to them in very simple words what it is actually meaning to them. And that's where a patient advocate comes in at the beginning, saying, well, keep your language very simple, keep it plain, keep it patient focused, not research focused. And I think that's where we're valuable, but it all starts at the beginning.
And I agree. I will just comment to explain that this involvement on patient-facing materials is starting from the grant application, when we are now in most of those big grant, we have been asked to show the approach to the, for example, patient information materials. How do you develop with patient and public partners those materials? So it's not, again, just an exercise to involve PPI, but having their perspective. Or, for example, is the PIS too long, this patient information sheet too long, or do we need to help and support the participants more information, but written in the right format? Because sometimes as a researcher, we are writing like all this jargon on the possible side effect, but it's just reading for most of the people 2 pages with no real meaning. So as Allan was showing in the results section, I think that explaining in lay terms or in simpler way will also help patient to accept and participate to research. Allan, I don't know if you have any comment on this.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, Sally says it perfectly well. It's simplifying it from the very start so people can understand, and not the case of just having one patient who happens to know one of the oncologists really well. You've got to have a group of patients, and that's how we've always worked over the last several years, by the way, because different people have got different views of how a study looks to them, what's important in terms of, is it too arduous, too much? Sally wonderfully talked about filling in lots of forms. I think many investigators still doing it because they feel it, they must do. And I think you need the patient advocates to pull them back and say, no, I wouldn't do it if I were in the study, as Sally would do herself.
Yeah, for sure.
I think you've got to be there at the beginning, and you've got to ask those challenging questions, not just say, oh, it's all right then. And that's what we're there for.
Yeah, I think this is very, very important, Sally, to be honest. And this is why we need to be challenged as researcher. Otherwise, we will not probably implement those feedback in the right way. For example, in the protocol, if a grant application will be successful. This is why I agree more than one patient advocate is so important to also give diversity, but also diverse perspectives. And sometimes I'm talking about age difference in inclusion, or of course gender, and I mean, even geographically difference if we're talking about national application, because each patient has different perspective on involvement.
And I should say that when we've been using the word challenging a few times between the three of us. I think in reality, don't confuse challenging with being overly confident. It's just saying, well, actually, I don't. And it's all done in a very nice way. It's a saying to the group, well, actually, I don't think that works, and that itself is the thing to get across.
So important. I absolutely agree, Allan. Sally, sorry, Corey.
It is about putting yourself in the patient's shoes, and does that work? Will that work? If I'm the patient, are all these steps going to work for me? And you can often pick them out, because not everybody can get to hospitals, not everybody's online, not everybody, Keats say, has got a reading age of something necessary to go in your career. So all these things, different languages, all these things have to come in to start with somewhere in the grant application.
Can I follow this up, and then I will leave to Allan to ask you some question. But based on your experience, what could researchers do differently to make this in the grant development process? What can they do to make the process of involving patient advocates more accessible and truly patient-centered? So to involve more in a meaningful way rather than just, can you review this lay summary exercise, as I call it?
But again, it's involving people right from the beginning, so they feel involved and an equal partner, not just somebody sat on the sidelines going, again, as I say, yes, that's all right, carry on. And involving, as Allan says, a number of advocates, but from diverse backgrounds. It's not always possible to get the diverse background, but groups of patients and carers give you slightly different ideas and aspects. So within the realms of possibility, as diverse a group you can actually find. And it is, but back to the tick box, that's why we're there for. It's back to good communication in good language, and it's support. Training, maybe you might get a bit of here's a sort of training sheet at the beginning, but it's support and training throughout the whole process, I think, is important. And that could be from anybody, but I do think it's important that you have one person to contact, that if you're struggling a bit, it's good to have, well, contact that person and they can help sort you out. I think that's very time factor. Certainly with things I've been involved with, some projects run exactly, you will have so many meetings, they will last this length of time, that's fine. Brilliant. One or two have crept into sort of twice, 3 times as many meetings, or have become a bit of a trial in themselves. So being quite accurate about time expectation at the beginning is quite important. And the other thing, I think you said it's great, and Allan said it'd be fantastic to see a thing all the way through, from the application all the way through to the results of the study. And if you could do that, that's great. But an advocate can not dip in and out, but maybe involved in an application. An advocate maybe further down the line in one of the committees. But I would always say that if you do come in after the beginning, ask what patient involvement has gone before, so that you know where they're up to. Have they done that? Maybe ask something else. So if you're not involved all the way through, when you get in there, do find out and make sure that there has been fairly firm input from patients beforehand, or carers.
This is a very good point. And as you said, I also would like to stress that the time commitment should be very clear. And what I'm personally trying to do, and I acknowledge that it's not always feasible, because we know that we're always meeting like 1 hour before the deadline of the grant application, but to involve patient advocate, to give them materials well in advance, is a very, very important aspect, because of course we are asking people with different background, and also the request of giving feedback to this lay summary or abstract again, or protocols, sometimes can be really more demanding for some people. So sometimes I'm approaching patient advocate and giving them even draft materials well in advance, that they then can be reviewed again in a second stage, but giving them enough time. So not asking to review very last minute. And this is a right of for everyone. So we should be very clear as researcher, but also from a patient advocate perspective, just do know that this is possible, and requesting a time commitment plan is also important, especially if people is working or has family commitment as well.
Yeah, I would certainly agree, and certainly giving information and documents to read in advance would be an absolute bonus.
It shouldn't even be a bonus. It should be.
It should be a given. And one or two things that go around.
Thank you so much, Allan. Do you want to?
Yeah, just a couple of questions, Sally. So I'm going to go to the end of the study again. So I gave a couple of slides of why I think it's important for patient advocates to have some understanding. Can you explain, Sad, in your own words, why you think it's important for them to have some understanding of how to interpret the results of a clinical study?
Well, I think you've got to have some general understanding. You don't have to have detailed understanding. I think we mentioned boffins before, and that's their world. You've got to have some understanding of figures just to be able to weigh up the risks and the benefits and outcomes. I mean, it's fantastic. We produce a drug that this will cure everybody, their cancer will be gone, but actually their side effects will be so bad or even worse that they can't tolerate it. So it's that general understanding of that delicate balance that you brought out in your talk.
Thanks. I mean, I've been in cancer research for many years. I've seen examples of cancer drugs that improve survival by 2 weeks on average, and when it's written up, it looks like it's fantastic. And I'm pretty sure that if a group of patients sat, and exactly as you said, it's got the nasty side effects. Exactly. So if you've got a group of patients who saw it and understood it, and they well, hang on, that's not worthwhile. That's not worth good with given all the side effects. But the investigators tend to write these things up. To report them in a sort of, I think, and unfortunately, very biased way, really. And I think that's why it's important for the patients involved at the end of a study, whether they're involved all throughout or they come in during the study, to sort of pull back those investigators from how biased they are. So I gave you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I thought your Keytruda thing was a very good, simple way. Okay, low numbers, but it was a very good way of, well, that looks really good. So, well, actually, it's not. It's a very simple way of thinking about it. I thought that was a good explanation.
You used a word a little while ago called weigh the benefit. That's that perfect word. You weigh the harms and the benefits. And if you think of weighing, remember the old-fashioned weighing scales with the little with the metal things on it? I remember from years ago. Cecilia won't. You're too young, but I do. And that is exactly what you do with weighing the harms and benefits. You think of putting certain weights on one group, on certain weights in the other one, and see how much it balances. That's literally what we're doing here in clinical research.
Yeah, and the patient's view of those weights might be slightly different to the very keen researcher.
Absolutely.
All about.
That's exactly it. It's not usually everyone agrees on all the time and what the benefit harm balance is. The last question is, so this is unavoidably involves looking at numbers. And I know some people are just a bit fearful of looking at numbers. My parents' generation certainly were. Any advice you can give to people watching this video on how to get a bit more confidence at doing this and not be put off?
Well, just get involved for a start. Numbers can be scary, whether they be big or small. It works for me to sort of look at them in a different way. For example, I find it easier to convert percentages in my head to, say, instead of 20%, 1 in 5, because I can immediately understand that. And I think for a lot of other people coming in to start with, they find it easier to think about that.
Yep.
If you're talking in terms of risk, 1 in 2 sounds a bit risky to me. But if you turn that around to 50 and 100, it's not quite so risky.
Oh,
and I tend to visualize things. I like boxes with 100 people in it, not dogs, but people, because when we're talking about medical research, we're talking about people. So you could do it that way as well. So you've got a visual presentation of it. So it's just converting numbers. So it basically means the same, but it's a different way of looking at the risk.
Yes.
When you get on to bigger numbers of sort of tens of thousands, I don't know, again, it's a visualization. I might think about in terms of a certain football stadium near here that's full at 60,000 and half is that. And that sort of comes in when you're talking about costs, drug costs and things. You tens of thousands of things. Well, that's half a stadium for one person, or it could be 2 or 3 stadiums for one person. Once you're up to millions, I do get a little bit lost because that appears on the a lot of the applications for funding, and you're into millions. So while I get a bit lost on the thing, that my role there is to say, well, what are you spending it on, and have you remembered to factor in all the things you need to do, including the patient's expenses or what they will need. So just looking at numbers a slightly different way and sort of visualizing them rather than just looking at the number on the page is something I found helpful.
I always say the number on the page is only half the story. It's what is that number represent? It's not a number. What is it? Is it the number of people whose cancer does not come back? Is it the number of extra months of life left? It's been really clear what it is. I tend to minimize using percentages, so I use 15 and 100, for example. So I always say visualize 10 or visualize 100 people. So I think most people can get up to 100. I don't want to get anything more than 100 in my head. Like it's 100, and then that's an idea. You're right. That's a nice analogy with the sort of football stadium. That's probably where the NHS starts to look at it, because they have to pay for it. So they're looking on a huge scale.
Yeah.
If I treat so many people, what's the benefit, the harms, and what's the cost of it? That's a fantastic analogy.
Yeah, and it's the cost. That's where it comes in, and I think a lot most patients advocates will come in thinking, yes, he's going to be fantastic and things, and a lot don't perhaps understand the actual cost of these drugs that are coming out. And again, that's why the research is done, to get that delicate balance of whether it's right or not.
That's it. I mean, we all want the new cancer treatments to work, by the way. We all do, and all the different cancer types, but some work better than others. And unfortunately, NHS can't afford all of them going forwards.
No, research is vital. I wouldn't be here without it.
So thank you so much. This has been, as the previous time, a very, very interesting conversation. And I want to thank you both, of course, for these 2 episodes. So thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned, because we are also preparing more resources for patient advocates within the BTOG. So we hope you find these webinars very useful, and please do send any feedback to info@btog.org, especially if you would like to explore different topics or more details information. So thank you so much again for listening, and we'll see you soon.